Western Europe. Late 1943, the pale morning sky trembles under the growl of engines. High above the clouds, a formation of silver dots drifts east. Republic, P-47 Thunderbolts, escorting bombers on their way to strike German industry. Far below, a flight of Luftwaffe FW-190s climbs to intercept. Their leader chuckles over the radio. The enemy ahead looks slow, heavy, and easy prey. Fliegende Milchflasche, he jokes, the flying milk bottle. They dive, sunlight flashing across their wings. The first burst of cannon fire misses. The thunderbolts don't break. Then, suddenly, the sky erupts in a solid wall of lead. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, all spitting flame. The laughter dies. Tracer lines slice through the air like burning ropes. One FW-190 disintegrates mid-turn, another spirals down, black smoke trailing behind. The German pilots pull back, stunned. The slow American fighters are climbing after them, faster than they believed possible. In minutes, the hunters have become the hunted. The P-47, mocked as overweight and ungraceful, is rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. That day, the Luftwaffe learned the hard way. The Jug was no joke. By early 1943, the skies over Europe had become one of the deadliest arenas of World War II. Every morning, hundreds of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators rose from bases in England, droning east toward Germany's industrial heartland. Their targets were the lifeblood of the Reich: oil refineries, aircraft factories, rail yards, and ball-bearing plants. But reaching those targets meant flying deep into enemy territory, through hundreds of miles of airspace controlled by the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force. The bombers could defend themselves with machine guns, but they were slow, heavy, and vulnerable once enemy fighters appeared. At first, the U.S. Army Air Forces believed in the doctrine of self-defending bombers. The idea was that tight formations of B-17s, bristling with .50 caliber guns, could protect one another. It was a theory that worked until it didn't. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe had torn that theory apart. American bombers attacking targets in places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg suffered catastrophic losses, sometimes more than 25% of the formation in a single mission. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 struck with deadly precision, climbing through bomber formations, firing cannons, and diving away before the slow-moving gunners could track them. The Americans needed something, anything, that could fight back, fly far, and survive. Yet the answer didn't come from the drawing board of a sleek designer dreaming up a perfect fighter. It came from a brute of an aircraft that few pilots wanted, a machine so big and heavy it seemed to defy logic. The Republic, P-47 Thunderbolt, was born out of compromise and desperation. When it first appeared in 1942, pilots laughed at its size. With its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, the plane weighed almost 8 tons loaded, more than some bombers. Its thick fuselage and stubby wings earned it the nickname the Jug. It didn't climb well, it didn't turn well, and it drank fuel like a monster. But what the skeptics didn't see was what made the Jug different. It could dive faster than any other Allied fighter, and lived to tell about it. Its airframe was built like armor plating, and its engine could take damage that would destroy a Merlin-powered Spitfire or Mustang. Most importantly, it carried 8 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, giving it the heaviest firepower of any single-seat fighter in the sky. In the beginning, the Thunderbolt was limited to short-range escort missions, defending bombers over France or Belgium. Pilots from the 56th Fighter Group, led by the charismatic hub Zemke, were among the first to prove what the Jug could really do. Zemke's men learned to use its strength, diving from altitude, hitting hard, and climbing away before the enemy could react. The Thunderbolt was like a heavyweight boxer, not elegant, but devastating once it connected. Still, one massive problem remained: range. The Thunderbolt couldn't reach Germany's deep targets and return home. The bombers that went too far east often had to fly without fighter escort, and that meant slaughter. In August 1943, after the disastrous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, American commanders knew that without a true long-range escort, the daylight bombing campaign would collapse. The race was on to extend the Thunderbolt's range to fit drop tanks to push the limits of endurance. And as engineers worked in hangars and airfields across England, the men who flew the Jug began to understand its true value. It was not the sleek, romantic hero of the air war. It was a survivor, a tank with wings, and it would soon turn from a laughingstock into a legend. The transformation was underway, and deep inside the Luftwaffe's control rooms, reports were beginning to circulate. Strange new American fighters were staying longer in the sky, hitting harder and flying higher than before. They didn't yet know it, but the balance of the air war was about to shift. By late 1943, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming the backbone of the US Army Air Forces in Europe. At airfields across southern England, Boxted, Halesworth and King's Cliff, the roar of its R-2800 engine echoed across the countryside each morning as pilots prepared for escort missions. But in the early days, few German pilots feared the Jug. From their cockpits, Luftwaffe aces saw a massive silhouette, slow to turn, sluggish to climb. They laughed at it. To them, it was an easy kill compared to the nimble Spitfires or the sleek P-51s that had begun to appear in limited numbers. What they didn't realize was that the Thunderbolt was changing fast. Engineers at Republic Aviation, under the leadership of Alexander Kartveli, began modifying the fighter for longer range and better performance. The addition of drop tanks, auxiliary fuel containers mounted under the wings, allowed Thunderbolts to stay in the air far longer than before. By the winter of 1943, the P-47's combat radius had more than doubled. The Juggernaut was now capable of escorting bombers deep into Germany to targets in Bremen, Hanover and Frankfurt, though it still couldn't yet reach Berlin. At the same time, the U.S. 8th Air Force began developing new escort tactics. No longer would fighter groups fly tight alongside bombers. Instead, formations of Thunderbolts swept ahead and above, engaging enemy aircraft before they reached the bombers. The idea was simple: hit the hunters before they could strike. Under Hub Zemke's leadership, the 56th Fighter Group became the proving ground for these tactics. Zemke understood that the Jug was not a Spitfire. It couldn't dogfight with the Luftwaffe's finest in a flat turn, but it could climb steeply and dive at terrifying speeds. Zemke drilled his pilots to use energy fighting, the art of using altitude and speed as weapons. When German fighters dove on the bombers, the Thunderbolts would swoop down from higher altitude, unleash a storm of 50 caliber rounds, and then zoom back upward before the enemy could react. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns made it one of the most heavily armed fighters of the war. Each weapon could fire 850 rounds per minute, hurling a combined total of nearly 7 tons of lead per minute when all guns were blazing. A short burst could rip apart a Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt or even a bomber in seconds, and because of its rugged construction and massive radial engine, the Jug could take punishment that would destroy most other aircraft. Pilots returned to base with wings torn, fuselages riddled, and oil leaking from the engine, yet still alive. As one American airman said, "If you're in a Thunderbolt, you might get shot up, but you'll get home. the Luftwaffe began to notice. Reports from squadron commanders described an American fighter that could dive like a falling building and climb again before pursuit was possible. Germans, pilots were shocked to find their cannons ineffective against the Jug's armor. Even a direct hit to the engine often failed to bring it down. But beyond the aircraft itself, something deeper was happening, a shift in air superiority. For the first time since the start of the war, the Luftwaffe was losing control of the skies. By early 1944, attrition had begun to eat away at Germany's veteran fighter corps. Allied bombing raids were striking not only factories and rail lines, but also airfields and aircraft plants themselves. Every time a P-47 pilot downed a German ace, the Reich lost not just one man, but years of hard-won experience that could never be replaced. And with the steady arrival of new models, like the P-47D Thunderbolt, fitted with improved turbo superchargers and jettisonable tanks, the Jug was becoming deadlier by the month. By the time the first P-51 Mustangs arrived in Europe in mid-1944, the Thunderbolt had already softened the Luftwaffe's defenses. It had flown more sorties, destroyed more enemy aircraft, and provided the brutal proof that American industry could produce not just in quantity, but in quality. The German laughter that once greeted the flying milk bottle was fading into unease, because soon those massive American fighters would not just defend bombers, they would hunt the hunters. The era of the Jug's dominance was about to begin. Angle 1, the human factor. The men behind the Jug every machine, no matter how powerful, depends on the people who fly it. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, that human element was forged in the crucible of the 8th Air Force. Young men, barely in their 20s, who climbed into cockpits heavier than some enemy bombers. They were called Jug pilots. And though they flew an aircraft that many once mocked, they carried themselves with quiet confidence. One of the most famous among them was Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, nicknamed Zemke's Wolfpack. Zemke wasn't a romantic ace chasing glory. He was a tactician, a thinker. He studied how German pilots fought, how they turned, climbed, and retreated. His methods turned the Jug from an underdog into a predator. Under Zemke, training was relentless. Pilots practiced high-speed dives, deflection shooting, and energy retention, skills that took advantage of the P-47's strengths. He told his men bluntly, "Don't turn with them. Climb, dive, use your weight and power. Make the Jug fight on its own terms." The pilots listened, and the results were devastating. Aces like Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, and Dave Schilling rose to fame in the Thunderbolt. Gabreski alone achieved 28 confirmed kills, all while flying the Jug. Johnson became legendary after surviving a Luftwaffe ambush, his aircraft shredded by 21mm cannon shells. Yet his P-47 brought him home, leaking fuel, holes everywhere, but still flying straight. When he landed, even his ground crew couldn't believe it had stayed in the air. To these men, the P-47 wasn't just a plane, it was armor, a guardian angel. They trusted it with their lives. Angle 2, tactical evolution, redefining air combat before the Thunderbolt. American pilots had been trained in tight formations and defensive flying, but the war over Europe demanded something different: speed, altitude, and aggression. The P-47's massive turbo-supercharged engine could propel it to over 430 mph and let it climb to 40,000 feet, far higher than most. German aircraft could operate effectively. Zemke realized this gave his men control of the fight from above. The new doctrine was called boom and zoom. It was brutally simple: dive fast, hit hard, and climb away before the enemy could respond. Unlike the elegant dogfights of early war films, Combat now became an explosion of seconds. A thunderbolt would appear from the clouds, unleash hundreds of 50 caliber rounds, and vanish skyward before the German pilot even realized what happened. This high-speed warfare required calm nerves and precision. Pilots had to calculate angles, airspeeds, and trajectories while bullets filled the sky. But the P-47 made it possible. Its control stability at high speeds was unmatched, and its rugged frame meant pilots could push it beyond limits most fighters couldn't survive. By 1944, Luftwaffe pilots dreaded seeing Thunderbolts above them. Their cannons were powerful, but the Jug was often too fast to hit. And when they did, it rarely went down. The air war had shifted. Where once the Luftwaffe dictated the terms, now the Americans controlled altitude, timing, and initiative. For the first time in the conflict, the hunters had become prey. Angle 3, Technological Superiority, Engineering. The B-stat, the heart of the Thunderbolt's power, was its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. Coupled with a General Electric turbo supercharger mounted in the rear fuselage, it could maintain peak performance even at extreme altitudes. No other Allied fighter of the time could match that combination of power and survivability. The thick armor around the cockpit and engine gave the Jug a near unheard-of level of pilot protection. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, and vital systems were redundant. A single bullet that might set a P-51 ablaze could bounce harmlessly off the Thunderbolt's armor, and if the worst happened, its massive radial engine often kept running, even with cylinders shot away. This resilience made the P-47 ideal for ground attack missions as well. By mid-1944, as the Allies prepared for the D-Day landings, the Jug began serving not only as a bomber escort, but also as a fighter bomber, strafing German convoys, tanks, and trains with deadly accuracy. Loaded with bombs and rockets, it became one of the most feared aircraft in the European theater. The Luftwaffe might have owned the sky in 1940, but by 1944, the P-47 was turning the tide of the entire air war. From its pilot's courage to its brute engineering, the Thunderbolt was rewriting air combat itself. But the true test of its legend, the moment that made German pilots abandon their laughter, was still to come. Because soon, the Jug would not just fight for survival, it would dominate the skies over Germany itself. Angle 4, the enemy's perspective, shock in the skies. For the German pilots who first encountered the P-47, disbelief was often followed by frustration, and then by fear. The Luftwaffe had built its early war supremacy on aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, nimble, quick, and deadly in a turning fight. They expected every opponent to play by those rules, but the P-47 broke them all. In early 1943, reconnaissance reports described the new American fighter as massive, slow-climbing, and unsuitable for dogfighting. German analysts even mocked it as a flying tractor. The laughter didn't last. The first real encounters told a different story. WW2 pilots reported diving after Thunderbolts, only to watch the Americans pull away effortlessly in the vertical. When engaged head-on, German fighters found themselves shredded before even closing range. The Jug's 850 caliber Brownings could throw over 100 rounds per second, turning the sky into a storm of fire. Even when a P-47 took hits, it refused to fall. Many Luftwaffe pilots recalled seeing their shells explode against the Jug's thick fuselage, only for it to climb higher, turn, and strike back. By late 1943, captured German airmen began referring to it with reluctant respect. Der Panzerjäger der Lüfte, the tank of the skies. The psychological toll was immense. You could outturn a P-47, but you could rarely outrun it. You could damage it, but you couldn't destroy it fast enough to survive the counterattack. And when formations of Thunderbolts appeared in numbers, dozens at once, high above bomber streams, the Luftwaffe's sense of control began to crumble. For the first time in the war, German pilots feared not just the numbers of American aircraft, but the invincibility of their design. Angle 5. Industrial power. The arsenal. Behind the jug, while Luftwaffe engineers fought shortages of aluminum, fuel, and manpower, the United States was running its war economy at full throttle. By 1943, American factories operated day and night, producing a staggering flow of aircraft, and the P-47 became one of the most mass-produced fighters of the entire war. Built by Republic Aviation in New York, with additional production lines at Curtiss-Wright and Evansville, the jug's assembly never stopped. At peak output, a new P-47 rolled off the line every 56 minutes. This industrial rhythm stunned German observers. Captured, officers couldn't believe that an aircraft so large and complex could be produced faster than their own small fighters. The Thunderbolt's design also reflected America's industrial mindset: power first, precision second. It wasn't delicate like the Bf-109, nor dependent on rare alloys or specialized craftsmen. It was designed to be maintained by field crews, repaired in muddy airstrips, and flown again within hours. Even the ammunition supply reflected this abundance. Each P-47 carried thousands of 50 caliber rounds, enough for prolonged bursts that most Luftwaffe fighters could never match due to ammunition limits and weapon overheating. When the 8th Air Force began sending hundreds of these machines deep into German airspace, they weren't just sending planes, they were sending the message of an unstoppable industrial tide. Germany had engineering brilliance, America had endurance. And by 1944, endurance was winning the war. Angle 6. The psychological edge. When fear replaced superiority. The Luftwaffe's decline wasn't just mechanical, it was mental. German pilots, once regarded as the elite of Europe, found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and outclimbed. The sight of a P-47 diving through the clouds became synonymous with hopeless odds. Reports from captured German airmen told of the same recurring scene: American fighters attacking from impossible angles, then vanishing before any counterattack could form. The P-47's thunderous engine sound was distinct, a deep, roaring growl that echoed before it appeared. Pilots on the ground could identify it instantly, and often ducked for cover, expecting strafing runs. By 1944, as the Allies pushed toward France, the Thunderbolt's reputation expanded beyond air combat. Villagers, soldiers, and even armored crews began referring to the American aircraft generically as Thunderbolts, regardless of model. They be testament to how deeply its image had burned into Axis morale. When the Luftwaffe intercepted Allied bombers, they no longer faced fragile escorts. They faced flying fortresses with machine guns powerful enough to turn their wings into dust. The laughter from 1943 was gone. In its place stood a grim realization. The Americans had not only matched German technology, they had surpassed it, mass-produced it, and filled the skies with it. The P-47 had evolved beyond its mockery. It was now both a weapon and a symbol of industry, innovation, and inevitability, and soon that inevitability would manifest in the most decisive moment yet, when the Jug met the Luftwaffe head-on, not in defense but in domination, Europe. Early 1944, the sky above Germany had become a battlefield of thunder. For years, the Luftwaffe had dominated the air, sleek Messerschmitts and deadly Focke-Wulfs patrolling the clouds like predators. But by now, the hunters were becoming the hunted. The American 8th Air Force was flying deeper and deeper into the heart of the Reich. Thousands of bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, filled the sky in formations so vast they blotted out the sun. Behind them came their new guardians, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts, engines howling with the rage of industrial power. At first, the Jug had been mocked as a defensive escort, a protector, not a killer. But in 1944, that reputation changed forever. The turning of the tide began with Big Week, February 2025, 1944 Operation Argument, a massive coordinated air offensive to destroy Germany's aircraft factories and cripple the Luftwaffe before the D-Day invasion. Every day, hundreds of bombers crossed the Channel, and every day, German fighters rose to meet them. But this time, the skies were not theirs to command. Flying at high altitude, the P-47s used their new drop tanks, extending their range deep into enemy territory. No longer did they have to turn back at the border, leaving bombers exposed. Now, they followed the fight all the way to the target and beyond. The results were devastating. When German fighters dove toward the bombers, Thunderbolts fell upon them like steel hawks. Their 8 50-caliber guns spat fire and brass, tearing through the formations with astonishing precision. Each burst could shred an aircraft's engine, wings and cockpit in seconds. Veteran German ace Heinrich Ehrler later admitted it was like fighting a wall of guns. Wherever you turned, a Thunderbolt was waiting. The battle over, Regensburg. On February 25th, near Regensburg, the Luftwaffe made a desperate stand. Over 300 German fighters scrambled to intercept American bombers heading for the Messerschmitt production plants. But what awaited them was not a mere escort mission, and it was an aerial ambush. At 25,000 feet, P-47 squadrons from the 56th Fighter Group, led by Hub Zemke, engaged head-on. Zemke's men had developed a new tactic called the Zemke fan. Instead of sticking close to bombers, Thunderbolts spread out wide in a fan formation, sweeping the skies ahead for incoming German fighters. When contact came, it was chaos. But it was American chaos. The sky erupted in cannon flashes and contrails. AW-190s dove in tight spirals, trying to shake pursuit, but the Thunderbolts dove faster, harder, deadlier. One pilot, Francis Gabi Gabreski, later recalled, "When you hit the trigger, the whole airplane shuddered, 8 guns roaring together. It felt like you were throwing the entire machine at the enemy." By the end of that single mission, more than 60 German fighters were down. The Americans lost fewer than a dozen. For the first time, the Luftwaffe had suffered greater losses than it could replace. The psychological impact was enormous. The myth of German air superiority, the same myth that had dominated since 1939, was beginning to collapse from escort to executioner. As spring 1944 arrived, the P-47 was no longer just an escort. It was a hunter. With the Luftwaffe's numbers dwindling, Allied commanders unleashed Thunderbolts on offensive sweeps. Their new orders were simple: seek, destroy, leave nothing that can fly. Day after day, P-47 groups roamed across occupied Europe, strafing airfields, trains, and supply convoys. The aircraft's rugged frame and heavy armor allowed pilots to dive to treetop level, absorb ground fire, and climb away unscathed. In 1 week, the 78th Fighter Group destroyed more than 400 German aircraft on the ground. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was losing 10 planes for every P-47 destroyed. The air war was turning into annihilation. German intelligence reports began to sound desperate. Enemy fighter-bomber activity now constant. Thunderbolts attack in pairs and groups, impossible to intercept effectively. Every airfield, every fuel depot, every train line was under siege from above. The Jug had transformed from a flying joke into a flying nightmare. Symbol of American sky power, what made the P-47's dominance even more astonishing was its scale. By mid-1944, over 5,000 Thunderbolts were active across Europe. Every day, they flew thousands of sorties, choking German airspace until nothing moved without risk. When Allied bombers struck Berlin in daylight, the Luftwaffe barely responded. Many of its remaining fighters were grounded, out of fuel, pilots, or morale. In the words of Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, the Thunderbolt and the Mustang have given the Americans control of the skies. Our pilots fight bravely, but it is like swimming against the tide, like the air war that began as a test of engineering had become a war of attrition, and the Thunderbolt, once dismissed as a blunt instrument, had become its sharpest edge. The Jug's legacy, however, was not yet complete. For in the summer of 1944, its role would evolve once again, from air superiority to ground destruction, in preparation for the most important invasion of the entire war, June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. At dawn, the largest invasion fleet in human history crept toward the French coast. More than 5,000 Allied ships carried men, tanks and dreams of liberation across the churning English Channel. But long before the first boots touched sand, the skies above the invasion beaches were already under Allied control, sealed off by Thunderbolts. For months leading up to D-Day, the P-47 had evolved from a high-altitude interceptor into something far more brutal, a precision strike weapon. Its .850 caliber guns were joined by bombs, rockets and napalm tanks. The once clumsy giant had become a flying sledgehammer. The air above Normandy as dawn broke over Omaha Beach. Formations of P-47s from the 9th Air Force roared overhead. Their job? To silence German artillery and prevent any reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Flying low through clouds of smoke and flak, they dove on targets, rail lines, troop columns, and command posts. Each pass left trails of fire and destruction. German soldiers, trained to fight Allied infantry, suddenly found themselves under a rain of steel from above. Pilot Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group recalled, "We could see the tanks on the roads. You dive, fire, and when you pulled up, you saw what was left. Nothing moved. Nothing survived." Within hours, the roads behind Normandy were littered with burning convoys and shattered armor. The German response to the invasion was crippled not by lack of courage, but by lack of movement. The Thunderbolt had achieved what Allied generals prayed for: air supremacy. Operation Cobra, Thunderbolts unleashed. By July 1944, the Allies were bogged down in the Norman hedgerows, trapped in a deadly maze of stone walls, fields and ambushes. To break the stalemate, General Omar Bradley launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout offensive supported by air power on an unprecedented scale. At dawn on July 25th, more than 2,500 Allied aircraft, including hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts, unleashed a storm of bombs and rockets on German positions near St. Lo. The ground shook as if the earth itself had turned against the Wehrmacht. German survivors described the horror in chilling detail. "There was nowhere to hide," wrote one officer. "Every tree, every field was on fire. The sky was filled with silver planes that spat fire. Thunderbolts flew so low that pilots could see enemy soldiers running for cover. Each strike tore gaps in the front lines, clearing the path for American armor to surge forward. When the smoke cleared, the German front in Normandy was shattered. The P-47 had not just supported the advance, it had made it possible. The German perspective, by mid-1944, Luftwaffe airfields in France were graveyards. Rows of wrecked Messerschmitts lay abandoned, their wings sheared off by strafing runs. German pilots were now vastly outnumbered, sometimes 10-1, and flying against a machine they once mocked. Even the FW-190, famed for its agility, could not dive fast enough to escape a Thunderbolt's guns. In desperation, the Luftwaffe shifted to night operations and hit-and-run attacks, but even then, the roar of a Thunderbolt's engine haunted them by day. Captured. German airmen would later admit that the P-47 changed the psychology of the battlefield. It wasn't just a plane, it was a presence. Every movement by road or rail had to be planned in fear of its arrival. Trains travelled under cover of darkness. Troops marched only at night. Even tanks were camouflaged under tree lines, hoping to evade the next strafing pass. Thunderbolts over the Falaise pocket in August 1944. The German army attempted a desperate retreat from Normandy through the Falaise pocket. Tens of thousands of troops, along with armour and vehicles, crowded the narrow roads. For the P-47 pilots circling above, it was an open invitation. They called it the shooting gallery. Wave after wave of Thunderbolts dove in, strafing columns of vehicles, blasting convoys with rockets, and leaving trails of smoke that stretched for miles. Entire German divisions were trapped and annihilated from the air. By the time it was over, more than 10,000 German vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The Luftwaffe could only watch helplessly as the ground war beneath them burned. One German tank commander, writing in his final diary entry, summed up the terror. The Thunderbolts come in twos, then fours, then more. They do not tire. The earth shakes with their anger. The Jug's evolution. Complete by the autumn of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had achieved something few aircraft in history ever could: total mastery of its environment. It had started the war as an overweight escort fighter and ended it as one of the most feared and versatile aircraft ever built. In every corner of the European theatre, it reigned supreme. Over 3,700 aerial victories, 86,000 ground targets destroyed, and an unmatched record for pilot survivability. The Germans, who once laughed, now stared skyward with dread, hearing that unmistakable, deep-throated roar, the sound of a R-2800 engine, bringing death from above. The Thunderbolt had not just changed the course of air combat, it had changed the very idea of what a fighter plane could be. As 1944 faded into 1945, victory seemed certain, but the cost was staggering. Europe lay in ruins, its skies still echoing. With the memory of war, the Thunderbolt's rain of fire had ended the Luftwaffe's dominance. But what came next would mark the transition from the age of piston engines to the dawn of the jet. By early 1945, the sky over Europe told a story written in smoke and contrails. What began as a desperate battle for air, superiority had turned into total Allied dominance. The key Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was broken. Its airfields were bombed, its fuel depots empty, its pilots either dead or too inexperienced to resist, and, flying above it all, leading the final assault on the heart of Germany, was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the warhorse that had earned its legend. A nation forged in steel and air power, In the last months of the war, the P-47's presence was everywhere. From Belgium to the Rhine, from the Ardennes to Berlin, the Jug served as the thunder in the storm of Allied firepower. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, bad weather initially grounded most aircraft. The Germans used that window to strike hard, pushing Allied lines back through the frozen forests of the Ardennes. But when the skies finally cleared on December 23rd, the Thunderbolts returned, and with them, vengeance. They struck at columns of panzers moving through narrow valleys. They destroyed bridges, fuel convoys, and supply trucks. By day's end, the German advance was crippled, and the Luftwaffe's last gamble was over. General George S. Patton later remarked that without air superiority, the Allies would have been blind, and without the Thunderbolt, that superiority might never have existed. The numbers tell the story. By VE Day in May 1945, the statistics of the Thunderbolt were staggering. Over 15,600 aircraft built, more than any other U.S. fighter except the P-51. More than 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Nearly 120,000 vehicles, bridges, and trains obliterated by ground attack missions, and perhaps most tellingly, the highest survival rate of any Allied fighter. A P-47 could take punishment that would shred any other aircraft. Engines torn by shrapnel, wings holed by flak, yet pilots often limped back home, landing their battered jugs on a single engine, oil spraying across the canopy. Veterans later joked that a Thunderbolt wasn't made to fly. It was made to crash well. The transition of power, even as the war ended, a new chapter in aviation was beginning. Jet engines, once experimental curiosities, were now the future. The Germans had fielded the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, too late to change their fate. But it was enough to show the Allies what was coming. The Thunderbolt, with all its brute power and heroic legacy, belonged to the age of pistons and propellers. Its successor, the Republic P-84 Thunderjet, would carry its spirit into the new jet era. But the lessons learned from the P-47's design, durability, firepower, and versatility became the foundation for modern ground attack aircraft. You can trace its DNA in every strike fighter that followed. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, named in its honor, would carry the same role decades later. A flying tank, built to protect those on the ground. The men who flew it, for the men who piloted the Thunderbolt. The memories never faded. Many were barely in their 20s, carrying both fear and faith into the clouds each morning. They watched friends vanish in fireballs, and others return miraculously, their aircraft shot to pieces. When peace finally came, they walked away from their beloved machines, leaving them parked in neat rows across airfields in France, England, and Germany. Most would never fly again. Yet in those quiet moments, the echo of engines cooling, the smell of burnt oil still thick in the air, they knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The Thunderbolt had not just won battles, it had reshaped the meaning of air power, proving that dominance in the skies could determine the fate of the war below. The guns would fall silent, but the legacy of the P-47 had only begun to take flight, and as the smoke cleared over Europe, the world's engineers, strategists, and dreamers began to study what the Thunderbolt had achieved and what it had made possible. When peace finally came to Europe in May 1945, the world stood among the ruins of its own creation. The cities were ashes, the airfields were silent, and the men who had fought in the sky were suddenly grounded, unsure of what came next. But one thing was already clear. The Republic, P-47, Thunderbolt had left behind a legacy that stretched far beyond victory. The warhorse that refused to die, while thousands of Thunderbolts were scrapped after the war. Hundreds continued to fly under new flags. The U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the United States Air Force, retained the aircraft for training and ground attack duties, but many more found second lives overseas. Britain, France, Italy, and even Brazil, nations that had fought beside America, took the P-47 into their post-war arsenals. The aircraft's reliability and ruggedness made it perfect for nations rebuilding their air power from ruins. In Brazil, the Thunderbolt became a national icon after its pilots had flown it bravely in Italy under the 1st Brazilian Fighter Squadron. They had called themselves Senta a Pua. Go for it! And their P-47s had destroyed hundreds of Axis positions during the final push to the Po River. Even after the war, they kept the aircraft flying proudly through the 1950s, honoring the machine that had carried them through their defining moment. From Europe to the Pacific and beyond, the P-47's reputation wasn't confined to Europe. In the Pacific, it had joined the fight against Japan in the war's final year, serving with distinction in the Philippines, New Guinea, and Okinawa. There it faced extreme heat, tropical humidity, and constant maintenance challenges, yet it remained dependable. It could fly through monsoon rain, take hits from ground fire, and still bring its pilot home. Japanese ground forces, already exhausted by years of war, were stunned by the sheer resilience of this American aircraft. It wasn't elegant like the Zero, but it was relentless, like the nation that built it. Even as Japan lay in ruins, captured officers and engineers examined the Thunderbolt's wreckage and were astonished at its engineering philosophy. Layers of redundancy, thick armor, massive power plants, a design that valued survival as much as speed. It was a flying embodiment of America's industrial strength and engineering pragmatism. The Cold War echo. By the late 1940s, a new world order was emerging. The Soviet Union and the United States stood as rivals, and once again, air power became the symbol of global influence. Though jets had taken center stage, the Thunderbolt remained in service in smaller conflicts, notably in Latin America and Asia. In places like Guatemala, Mexico, and Yugoslavia, P-47s roared over jungles and mountains, long after the war that created them had ended. Each time, they carried the same message: the durability of American design, the reach of its technology, and the legacy of those who had fought in the skies over Europe. The legacy takes new shape in the 1970s, when the U.S. Air Force introduced a new ground attack aircraft designed to protect soldiers in modern warfare. They chose a familiar name: the A-10 Thunderbolt II. It was slow by jet standards, ugly by fighter standards, but unstoppable in combat, just like its ancestor. It too carried .50 caliber lineage, now replaced by a massive 30mm GAU-8 cannon, and it too could take hits, lose engines, and keep flying. Every detail of the A-10's philosophy traced back to the P-47, a direct descendant of its spirit. The name Thunderbolt had come full circle. History's final judgment today, historians regard the P-47 Thunderbolt not just as one of the best fighters of World War II, but as the most versatile. It was not graceful, but it was effective. It was not revolutionary, but it was indestructible. For the Luftwaffe pilots who had once laughed at its bulk, the sound of those 8 .50 caliber machine guns had changed their laughter to fear. For the ground troops it protected, it was the difference between life and death. And for the engineers and workers back home, men and women who had built the Thunderbolt in factories that never slept, it stood as proof of what American industry could achieve when united by necessity and belief, the skies above. Europe would never again see the same kind of war, but in museums, air shows, and veterans' memories, the deep roar of the P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine still echoes, a ghostly thunder rolling through time. Its story wasn't just one of destruction, it was one of endurance, innovation, and the unbreakable will to win. The legacy of the Thunderbolt would outlive its era, and its thunder still rolls in the history of every aircraft that came after it. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not just the tale of an aircraft, it is the story of a nation that built its strength not from fear, but from determination. In the dark years of World War II, when the skies over Europe were filled with fire and steel, the Thunderbolt stood as a symbol of something deeply American: endurance through overwhelming odds. It was not elegant, it was not refined, but it was reliable, relentless, and unstoppable. That mattered more than beauty. Every rivet, every bolt, every line of the Thunderbolt spoke to an industrial miracle, the ability to turn raw metal into flying fortresses of freedom. American workers, women in factory aprons, men too old or too young to fight, built this machine day and night. And in their hands, the hum of production lines became as important as the roar of engines in the sky. Those factory floors in Farmingdale, Evansville, and Indianapolis were the unseen front lines of the air war. Each completed Thunderbolt meant more than a new weapon. It meant a young pilot might come home alive. For the Germans who once mocked it, the sight of the P-47 became synonymous with despair. For the Americans who flew it, it was home, a flying fortress of steel and noise that could carry them through the fiercest battles and back to base. It was not simply a tool of destruction, it was the protector of men, the shield of convoys, the avenger of those lost. And in that duality, the power to destroy and the power to save, the Thunderbolt revealed the moral weight of modern warfare. When the war ended and the skies fell silent, the P-47's thunder faded into history. But its echo remains, not only in the roar of jet engines that followed, but in the unspoken lesson it left behind. Strength alone wins battles, but endurance wins wars. The P-47 Thunderbolt endured. In its metal skin lived the story of a world that refused to surrender, a story of courage, ingenuity, and the will to rise again through the smoke. And somewhere, even now, in the stillness of a museum hangar or the distant rumble of a restored engine starting up, the thunder returns.